The years have come and gone, and Evil Dead franchise fans are always left hankering for more. Our iconic chainsaw-wielding hero lives in our memories and some really good comic book crossover. Things were starting to dim out and fans felt like our hero would never return again, but then, in 2015, things took a turn for the better. Fans got the return of Ashley J. Williams. Instead of getting some kind of cameo tease or watered-down reboot, fans got the real deal. Ash vs. the Evil Dead was the real thing. It was supposed to be a full-blown continuation of Sam Raimi's horror trilogy, with Bruce Campbell back in all of his big-chinned glory. This was everything that long-term fans were waiting for and more. There was slapstick gore, practical effects, and cheesy one-liners. There was a loyal cult following, and there was critical praise. Things were fine, right? But despite all of that, the show was canceled after just 3 seasons. This left all those longtime fans wondering just one question: what the hell happened? Before we get too deep into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Ash vs. Evil Dead was not a reboot of the series. It was a revival that was completely miraculous, if we're being honest. And the reason they managed it? They ignored the entire continuity that Fede Alvarez created in 2013, and Bruce Campbell returned as Ash. Definitely older, but none the wiser. This Ash lived in a trailer and worked at a value stop while still completely horrified by the events at the cabin. Bruce Campbell resurrected the character, and we got to see the right version of Ash aged up. Someone who's a grizzled hero, but still an arrested man-child. He was exactly how we remembered him, but somehow older and more layered. The moment Ash vs. Evil Dead began, the show felt like it belonged in the Evil Dead canon. It was perfect. Sam Raimi didn't just give his blessing for this show. Nope. He co-created the show with Tom Spazzili and his brother, Ivan Raimi, and even directed the pilot. Thanks to that, we would say that Ash vs. Evil Dead actually set the tone right from the first episode. You had the visual insanity, the complete lack of restraint, and of course, the breakneck pacing. From the pilot, you can understand straight away that this show was not just nostalgia bait. This was Evil Dead. It was pure, uncut, and unfiltered. All the things you want in a show that's supposed to be a continuation of a wild franchise like Evil Dead. The series made its style clear from the get-go. You got back not just the blood geysers, but also the demonic entities who were screeching the entire time, more commonly known as Deadites. The fan-favorite demons came on the screen with freakish agility and twisted grins, which was enough for fans like us to hop on board. The boomstick was back, and so was the chainsaw. But there was a little twist. This time, Ash wasn't alone. Enter Ray Santiago playing Pablo Simon Bolivar, and Dana DiLorenzo playing Kelly Maxwell. When new characters like this are introduced in long-standing franchises, you think it's just going to be some sidekick business. But let me tell you, Ash vs. Evil Dead wasn't about that. These characters were full-on members of the anti-Deadite squad. Pablo believed Ash was the prophesized El Jefe, given his loyal, well-meaning, idealistic nature, whereas Kelly, the sarcastic and sharpshooting skeptic, was just as cool and badass as Ash was. They became not only the token additions, but also the emotional backbone of the series. Then, as if that wasn't enough, we got Lucy Lawless, Miss Xena herself, as Ruby, a mysterious figure who clearly has her own motives and a secret, deep connection with the Necronomicon. Lawless brought her own gravitas to the show while adding to the ensemble and increasing the narrative weight. She started out as this antagonist, but soon became a reluctant ally and eventually turned into an apocalyptic wildcard. From the moment you're introduced to her, you can understand that she was playing the long game, and in the end, it really paid off. The show embraced its horror roots, and when we say horror roots, we're not just talking about jump scares or gore. There is enough of both, but what truly sets this show apart is the absurdity of it. There were chainsaw fights in the morgues, Deadites who had inappropriate anatomical effects, and even a demonic colonoscopy scene which had everyone gagging, laughing, and rewinding. The show cranked Evil Dead to 11, so basically the show was everything that Raimi perfected in Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness. While the show is often praised for all of these traits, the quality of the show that deserves to be noted is how emotionally resonant it was. And it was all because of Bruce Campbell. Ash is still as wisecracking as ever and still fumbling through battles, but the writing of the show gave him layers we've never seen before. Ash was forced to confront his past, deal with his survivor's guilt and broken relationships, and eventually fatherhood. We got to see the genuine arc buried beneath the blood, and Campbell absolutely smashed it. Bruce Campbell delivers his best work as Ash, bringing a subtlety to this character which is usually excessive. Anyone else playing Ash would have turned the character into a caricature, but Campbell dug deeper instead. His acting chops made you start to care about the guy who would flash his boomstick if you wanted to flirt. The kind of lore you get about the character in the story is usually rare in the horror genre, and the fact that we got it from the Evil Dead universe is truly something. From the moment you see the show, you can understand that the production behind the scenes was equally committed. In an era where showrunners preferred CGI over practical effects, Ash vs. Evil Dead showrunners instead insisted on the practical effects wherever they could. CGI was mainly ignored and used sparingly as a supplement for old-school techniques. You can see the handcrafted creature designs, latex monsters, and blood squibs dominating the screen, and that made the show feel a lot more tangible. It feels like this show is actually a Sam Raimi film that was dug out of a cursed vault instead of a show that was produced now. And the energy of the show, oh my god! Most horror shows have a groove, slow burns, jump scares, and quiet dread. But instead, Ash vs. Evil Dead was like a jolt to the system. The fight scenes were completely chaotic. The dialogue flew out at high speed, and every scene had a frenetic energy to it. We got whiplashed from comedy to horror to emotional introspection, all back to back to back. So the best way to describe the show would be a controlled metal concert. Overall, the show was completely unique, and critics loved it. Everyone praised it for maintaining the tonal tightrope and the mix of laughs and legitimate horror. Many mentioned that the pilot, directed by Sam Raimi, was one of the best TV premieres. It had everything fans wanted and more. And the show didn't just rely on fan service. There were a bunch of callbacks like Henrietta, Kandar, and the return of the cabin, but the show built a new mythology too. The Book of the Dead was now a gateway. The show gave us realms, otherworldly beings, prophecies, and the Knights of Sumeria. The show made it clear that the creators were trying to expand the lore and give Evil Dead its own cosmic horror universe. Ash vs. Evil Dead had low expectations when it debuted, but after its debut, the show blew us all apart. It had everything for everyone, from nostalgic gore for the veterans, high-octane chaos for the new fans, and the character depth that was enough to surprise die-hard fans. The first season ended on a fitting, albeit slightly controversial note. Ash made a deal with Ruby, choosing himself over the world. It was like the most Ash-esque decision-making ever. The finale of the first season promised more to come, and for a while, it really felt like the show was going to keep going and keep giving us whatever we needed and more. But what we didn't know was that the dream was about to hit a wall, not because of creative failure, but simply because of business realities, streaming landscapes, and marketing missteps. When the second season came out, the show was full of confidence. There was no sophomore slump. While Season 1 proved that the show could recapture the old magic, the second season was all about pushing boundaries. It was bloodier, weirder, and more complex than before, and somehow it managed to be absolutely believable. There was a beautiful chemistry between Pablo, Ash, and Kelly, and it blossomed into something special. The comedy of the second season was a lot sharper, and the mythology a lot deeper, whereas the tone was a lot more unhinged than before. Pablo, Ash, and Kelly were more than a ragtag team. Instead, they were like a gore-soaked, dysfunctional family. Ray Santiago's Pablo was given a beautifully rich arc as he turned from the comic relief into a spiritual conduit and then a straight-up deadite target. His connection with the Necronomicon came up and became extremely important as the dark forces behind the book started deepening in disturbing ways. Kelly, on the other hand, was everything fans wanted. She was fearless, hilarious, angry, and sometimes even more competent than Ash. Speaking of him, Ash and Ruby were now in a full-on mix. Sometimes enemies, sometimes allies, it felt like the show was giving us new unexplored genres in this world, and as a longtime Xena fan, it was great seeing Lucy Lawless on screen. The commitment they had to practical effects held on steady as we moved into the second season of the show. As you might have guessed, Ash vs. Evil Dead continued to set itself apart. The infamous morgue scene of the second season, where Ash ends up with his head up a corpse's rear end, is iconic and extremely gross, which makes this show stand out from all the other popular shows during that time. It was completely unapologetic about what it was, and I can bet that you could never imagine another show doing anything like that. With each episode, the show didn't just prove itself to be a worthy Evil Dead continuation, it also gained enough traction to be considered maybe the best entry in the entire franchise. Campbell's performance gave us not only hijinks, but also emotional depth, which I guess a lot of us weren't expecting at all. He's no longer just a joke machine. He has PTSD and loneliness, and he's come to terms with the fact that his arrogance has consequences. The show doesn't stop there either. It also gives us a deep dive into who he is as a person. We learn about his past and his hometown, Elk Grove. We also learn more about his father and what made him the way he is. The scenes we get between him and Brock Williams, his father, played by none other than Lee Majors, brought poignancy and heartbreak to the table, which we weren't expecting. That's why when, spoiler alert, Brock dies after a moment of reconciliation, it hurts so much and the pain lingers. When so many things are going right for this show, you gotta wonder why the show wasn't exploding with the mainstream public, right? The answer to that question, well, it's a bit complicated. So the show was being streamed on Starz. If you don't know about the channel, that's understandable because this channel is a second-tier premium cable channel miles below the popularity of Netflix or HBO. So while Starz gave the show creative freedom to be as wacky as it wanted, the channel had a limited subscriber base and, understandably, a limited footprint with an international crowd. In fact, many horror fans can't even actively tune in on Starz. It had virtually no streaming infrastructure to speak of when Ash vs. Evil Dead debuted. This was, as you might have guessed, a big problem. The show wasn't available on platforms like Netflix or Hulu well after the first season aired in some regions, which was absolutely terrible. By the time streaming audiences found out what Ash vs. Evil Dead was like, the show was already in its second season. The show didn't get the momentum or the buzz that Game of Thrones or Stranger Things got back when they aired. It's not like the show was bad or that there was no fan base. However, the problem was that you couldn't watch the show if you didn't pirate it, and that's what a lot of people did. Piracy rates for Ash vs. Evil Dead were reportedly more than the number of official viewers. And given that the marketing was minimal at best, we believe Ash vs. Evil Dead didn't get the bang that it deserved. The series got a Comic-Con presence and a few trailers, but that was because Starz had a small promotional budget. The network preferred to put more emphasis on Power, Outlander, and Black Sails, the other shows from this channel that had more appeal overall. Ash vs. Evil Dead was a passion project, but on a niche network, which immediately dwarfed the glory it could have had. Niche shows deserve active promotion. Being passive for a niche show is a death sentence, but that's exactly what happened for Ash vs. Evil Dead. Despite all of that, though, the show managed to maintain solid numbers for a horror series, especially throughout its first 2 seasons. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it was respectable. In Season 1, every episode averaged around 400,000 live viewers, and in the second season, the numbers dipped a little, but still, they remained within expectations. Despite all the issues we've mentioned before, the show managed to maintain its momentum through delayed viewings and streaming numbers. Fans were watching the show wherever they could, and when they did, they loved it. However, this passion in the heart of the fans was simply not translated into growth. Even Bruce Campbell hinted at this disconnect during press tours. He mentioned how frustrated he was with the marketing approach and how hard it was for fans who wanted to watch the show but couldn't even find it. He was being entirely realistic, and it makes sense, because under all the chainsaw grins and wacky hijinks, under the surface, the cast and creators were fighting to keep the show alive. They knew that the show they were making was something special, but thanks to all the circumstances in which they were releasing the episodes, they were shouting into the void. The creative team refused to compromise despite all of this, and because they were so genuine in their work, it hurt even more when there was a decline in the viewership. Everyone agreed that the second season was stronger than the first, but it failed to grow the audience. The show was hitting its stride and there was no drop in quality. However, due to the lack of promotion and the limited accessibility, the number of shows was not enough for the premium network to keep paying. When Season 3 came out, you could see the cracks forming already. Rumors started to surface about Starz tightening the budget. There were also evident shifts behind the scenes because you could see that some episodes were a little less polished in comparison to the rest. But Bruce Campbell, Ray Santiago, and Dana De Lorenzo were doing their best to keep the show alive. However, the stress was starting to show and Starz was starting to back away from the show that they once celebrated. And this is what sucks. The third season of the show was the boldest of all. The show took an exciting pivot into new territory. We were introduced to Brandy, Ash's daughter, played by Ariel Carver O'Neill. This was not only a fresh emotional dynamic, it meant that Ash had more at stake beyond survival. He had a legacy, and the show was now expanding into apocalyptic territory. The show was gearing up to be something bigger than anything anyone had expected, but Starz wasn't listening. The network's commitment to the show was starting to waver. The third season ended on a massive cliffhanger with a Mad Max-style tease of the future war against the Deadites. You would assume that with such a high-tension ending, there would be some kind of buzz. There would be some press push or some kind of announcement. However, there was nothing. There was simply silence. After the finale aired, a few days went by and the inevitable happened. Starz officially canceled Ash vs. Evil Dead. The announcement was like a sucker punch. On one hand, it was because the story was building up to something and was left hanging, but on the other hand, fans knew that the quality of the show had no role in the cancellation of it. The show wasn't a creative failure, it was a business move, a cost-cutting move if you want to put it that way. The nice gem was crushed because the system couldn't do anything with it. And then came the worst heartbreak of all. Bruce Campbell went to Twitter, and with just one sentence, he ended a decade-long legacy. He said he was done playing Ash, and it was time to hang up the chainsaw for good. I mean, how sad is that? It wasn't the Deadites that defeated Ashley J. Williams, but the industry itself. The third season of this show was supposed to be a turning point for all the characters, mostly Ash and the entire mythology of the franchise. The show had spent 2 seasons building up the stakes and re-establishing the tone that fans loved, but when the third season came, it took us directly into uncharted territories. The show was becoming epic, and then everything was cut off. Bruce Campbell announced his retirement, marking not just the end of the show, but the end of an era of Ash Williams. For decades, Ash has been Bruce Campbell's most defining role. He's played that character for so many years in movies, video games, countless conventions, interviews, cameos, and now these 30 episodes of television. He lived and breathed Ash Williams, so for him to give up means that the cancellation of the show actually broke something, not just in the fans, but also in the actor. Thousands of fans were freaked out hearing Bruce Campbell retire from Ash. Major entertainment outlets quoted that tweet, and there was heartbreak across the horror fandom. But that was it. This was the end. They weren't going to do any more reboots, revivals, or movies. Ash was finally done. This was disappointing. Not only had we lost out on Season 4, which we were completely hyped about, but the show had done the impossible. Ash Williams was brought back to life thanks to this show, and he was made better than ever. We watched him grow, fail, love, screw up, and win. We loved that. We got answers to questions we didn't even know we had to ask, and we got callbacks that we never expected. Pablo, Kelly, and Brandy could have carried the torch because they were absolutely perfect, but Starz didn't care. There was so much story left, but Starz simply didn't care. The fan base, on the other hand, cared a lot. Hashtags like Bring Back Ash vs. Evil Dead and Save Ash vs. Evil Dead exploded all over social media. There were petitions everywhere. Fans were tagging any premium streaming website they could find on their tweets, begging, hoping that someone would simply swoop in and help the hero and the show. After all, we'd seen that happen before. Lucifer was revived by Netflix, just like Longmire and The Expanse. So why not Ash vs. Evil Dead? Fans noticed that Netflix had international distribution rights in several countries, and given that the show was performing well in streaming numbers in horror communities and was binge-worthy for new fans, it kinda seemed like a no-brainer. However, Netflix, Amazon, and Hulu, the 3 streaming giants, had nothing to say, not a single peep. Another part of the issue, according to insiders, was the rights. Lionsgate had partial rights, and Bruce Campbell and Sam Raimi had some creative ownership, but the key to everything was with Starz. Starz owned the show. Without their participation or a buyout, no one could swoop in and save the day, and Bruce's retirement added more complications to the matter. Whatever attempt to revive the show could have been made now felt sacrilegious for most fans to even think about, because without Bruce Campbell, who could ever step into the boots of Ash Williams? Sam Raimi was open to other Evil Dead stories and even considered the idea of an animated continuation, but only if Campbell was willing to lend his voice as Ash. But nothing came of it, and Raimi went on to direct Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Campbell, on the other hand, focused more on producing, writing memoirs, and hosting game shows. The cast also moved on. Both Dana De Lorenzo and Ray Santiago talked about the show fondly in interviews, but it made sense that the energy that's necessary for a potential comeback was simply not there. But wait, it gets worse. 2023 rolled around and Evil Dead Rise hit the theaters. We got a new film, a new cast, and a darker tone, and there was still no Ash. The film was well received. It was gritty, brutal, and terrifying in ways that reminded us of the original 1981 film's raw power. But the franchise was evolving, and it felt like the Raimi/Campbell era was completely sealed off. The new generation of Evil Dead was finally being born. This era had no Ash Williams and no Ghost Beaters. As Evil Dead Rise continued to succeed, we longtime fans felt a bittersweet air. It was proved to us that the franchise still had life, but clearly not enough for Ash vs. Evil Dead to be a thing. This wasn't the failing of the fans, creators, and definitely not a failing by Ash himself. Now that it's been a while since the cancellation of the show and the pain has settled down a bit, looking back at the show feels like performing a post-mortem on something revolutionary. This wasn't some cash grab by bringing back a cult character. This show did that, and it did so without any compromise. In an era where revivals or reboots feel sanitized, safe, and purely nostalgic, this show was unapologetic about what it was all about. Ash vs. Evil Dead didn't want to tap into a trend. It was clearly a spiritual continuation that made everyone love the source material even more. And that's the part of the show that makes this loss so frustrating. We weren't losing a fun horror show. We were losing a rare piece of pop culture honesty. This show proudly embraced the absurdity of its roots while also keeping it all clever, emotional, and heartfelt. Ash vs. Evil Dead has more soul than most of the prestige horror shows that get showered with awards and acclaim. It didn't pretend to be more than it was simply genuine. The irony of this whole thing was right. As the story was getting close to evolve and transform into something bolder, it got cut down. We'll never know what could have happened in the 4th season. Maybe we would have seen Ash going through a wasteland of deadites. Maybe Brandy could have become an excellent warrior in her own right. Maybe Pablo could have become a full-on shaman and guided Ash through dimensions. The possibilities were endless, and the worlds we could have seen and the adventures we could have been on were just as endless. But the doors are now closed, and unless Bruce Campbell comes out of retirement, that door is closed for good. And let's not forget how amazing the supporting cast was. Ray Santiago gave Pablo some real heart and humility, even though he had arguably some of the show's darkest moments. Then we had Dana De Lorenzo's Kelly, who was a revelation. In every aspect, she was Ash's equal, and she was more. She had a fury and an edge that Ash didn't have. They could have just been normal side characters, but in reality, they were modern horror icons in the making. If the show hadn't been cancelled, we probably would have seen them in their own spin-offs. Maybe they would have taken the franchise in a completely new direction. But instead of all that, they were left in limbo, just like Ash was trapped in that post-apocalyptic future that we'll never get to see. Even though the show has ended, the cultural impact of it remains. Every time you walk into a horror convention, you can see just how much fans loved it. Reddit threads and fan edits on YouTube are still being created to this day, introducing new horror fans to this amazing show. People still talk about this show because it wasn't just good, it was special. It was made for the fans by people who introduced them to this wild world in the first place, and that's a rare thing in the horror genre, and it's worth mourning. Even though it's been years since the final episode aired, the spirit of the show still pulses through the horror community. You can see how it's inspired fan films, horror comedies, and even the tone of the newer Evil Dead. However, Sam Raimi's madness, Bruce Campbell's charisma, and the storytelling of the Stars series are a blend that cannot ever be replicated. It was unique and rare, and we had it, even for just a moment, showing us just how beloved this show was and how much we would have to miss once it was gone. Some fans, like me, are still here hoping for a return. Whether it's a miniseries or an animated show with Bruce voicing Ash, we're not going to be picky, because deep down, we all know that the show ended because the industry wasn't ready for a show like this, a show that refused to water itself down. That's why the fans rallied and hashtags trended, and that's why it still hurts. This wasn't just a show, this was a resurrection, and it gave us a stage where Ash could stretch his wings, both as a hero and a flawed human. And now it's gone. But dead doesn't mean gone, and the boomstick echoes. So perhaps we got the most Evil Dead ending of all. Even though we cut to black, the evil never really died. Marvelous verdict! Ash vs. Evil Dead was more than just a show. It was a miracle. It was a revival that honored the legacy and the roots it was created from, even though it kept pushing itself forward in bold and brilliant ways. In a way, the show gave us closure and opened new doors to the character and the world. While it's true that the show was cut short by corporate silence and platform failings, the heart of the show still beats in horror communities. It gave us an example of how good revivals can be when done right, how much cult heroes still matter. So, the show may be dead, but Ash is timeless, immortal, or as he would put it, groovy. With that, we come to the end of our video. Let us know what you guys think about this show and if you actually managed to watch it. We'd love to hear about your favorite moments. I mean, obviously, we love basking in the nostalgia. Either way, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.